This is the Education Business Podcast for consultants and business owners providing services in schools. I'm Claire Riley, and I'll be sharing how to start, grow and scale your education business. Frank, welcome back to the Education Business Podcast.
Thank you very much for inviting me back.
So we've had a number of months since we last spoke, and more has happened in the world of education business. So let's just get straight into it. Some people might have read the commercial education brief. Maybe they haven't. They should definitely go read it, shouldn't they, if they haven't yet?
Yeah, I would say so. Yes. We can add you to our mailing list.
Yes, exactly. So let's talk about some of the themes that were in that commercial education brief. And you can probably give a few more updates than when it first went out, which is great. So the first thing I thought would be great to talk about is the DfE's commitment to AI.
Yes. DfE continue to recognise that AI is going to have a presence in schools, for certain. And quite what that presence is, I think, is still very much up for discussion. There'll be a lot of trial and error, I expect. But one thing that the government has done as an early initiative of the new government is to say, right, within the department, we have got a rich content of information, curriculum information, teaching materials and so on, that we can open up and make available to schools. Now, we can't do this ourselves, so we need help in this. So they have put together a programme, and they've now appointed a company called Faculty AI to lead on this. And Faculty AI, together with a few partners, will create the framework, if you like, almost, you could call it the scaffolding, which is a more topical term to use, that will allow access to that data. The Open University is also involved in this. It's not clear what their role is and the extent of their commitment to it at the moment, but that will become clearer. And there is a competition that has been ongoing for some time now, allowing organisations to say they'll support the department. And this is the first announcement of a partnering arrangement with Faculty AI. The interesting thing is that these are the companies that Faculty AI are working with are enablers. They will create the infrastructure, as I called it, for access to the content. But of course, there's a whole load of education businesses out there that will be really interested in what's happening and will want to be party to this. The original competition rules said that whoever gets involved in this will obviously to have an ability to commercialise what is to be achieved. But at the same time, it was leaving open, and quite rightly leaving open, the fact that others should be participating in it as well. So quite how the commercial education sector, if we can call it that, will be supercharged through this effort is a bit unclear at the moment. There's a lot more to come out. And I think one negative comment that's been made about it is, okay, the government's spending a lot of time in a facilitating role, but the one thing it's not doing is facilitating schools in their use of AI. And a number of comments are being made about the fact that there aren't programs to support teachers really understanding how to adopt AI tools in the classroom and in management roles and so on. And that is something that the government will no doubt need to start to look at. They'll be under a lot of pressure to do that.
Yeah, I guess in a safe way as well, because I definitely see a lot in the Facebook groups, people will say that they're using AI, and one of the things Ed says, like, that's not bad or anything, but if they're not trained on what not to feed the AI, this is a key problem, and it's things like data and things like that, isn't it? It's quite dangerous.
Yeah.
So based on this funding, is it true that now that that's happened, there will be no more funding? Because we looked into it and it said whoever wins this will basically get all the funding, I think. And there'll be no more opportunities for other people to get funding to help with it.
Yeah, that is a point which requires some explanation on the part of the department. This is being undertaken through a separate body that is facilitating the passing down of the funding. And they made a mistake when the competition started by sending out terms and conditions for grants. And they withdrew that and they sent out terms and conditions of a contract instead. Now, the subtle difference there is that obviously subsidy control won't apply if it's a commercial contract. It's only grants that are affected, usually by subsidy control. There can be exceptions to that. And
just explain to a 10-year-old, me, yes. What subsidy control is.
So, subsidy control is where a public body gives incentives, targeted incentives to particular organisations that actually give them an advantage over other businesses working in the same sector. And so the original thought seems to have been that this was a subsidy that was being provided to companies that win through in the competition. And as you rightly said, the terms and conditions said more funding will be made available to these bodies. But that doesn't make sense in a grant situation because you get into all sorts of complications. So they did change it rather strangely to a contract with these parties. Now, importantly, the contract does require them, the parties that benefit from the funding, to open up to other parties the benefits of the project. Quite how that will happen is unclear at the moment, and you would like to think, and I do think, that the department are really saying, you're going to help us make our content accessible in ways that will help the education system. And it will only be of help to the education system to maximum effect if it is truly open to others to use as well, at no cost to them, hopefully, or no charges, shall we say, no royalty payments and things like that. So we're going to be following this very closely because it's a really interesting area.
Yeah, it'd certainly be interesting to see what they do. Do you think there's a risk in, because it's partnered obviously so closely with the government, that they will say, okay, you now have to use this particular thing?
I think the government is pretty clear in saying that it wants a free market, and they realise that schools and teachers want a lot of freedom to deliver the curriculum. They have to meet the expectations of the curriculum to educate children effectively. But teachers value a lot of freedom. And we saw this with the Oak National Academy, where many teachers and their union were very anti the continuing of that organisation. And behind that was very much the freedom and the flexibilities that teachers value in their job.
Yeah, oh, can't agree more, really. It will be really interesting, I suppose, at this stage, as an education business, you can be thinking, oh, what are the opportunities for me? What are the risks? But really, it's a waiting game to figure out what those opportunities and risks might be, to see what actually ends up happening.
Yeah, I think it is. There's two reasonably clear categories of providers of support to schools. Those that provide the content, that support the curriculum, that help bring to life what children need to learn and understand. And then there's the part of the education business community that then looks at the outcomes of that assessment. And you would think that it's the assessment part that is going to be most interested in what's going on just now, because there's already considerable application of AI into assessment, and what's obviously is called personalised learning, where a child maybe gets a question wrong but is prompted to try again and get the answer right. And that's where content comes in again. So you've got a crossover between the two. So there's some interesting times ahead, and I think both content providers and assessment assessment businesses will be really interested in this, but particularly assessment.
Yeah, to see how it goes. Oh, thank you. Right, this is not necessarily about education, but it is about business. So we've got some changes in UK employment law.
Yes.
As an employer, I'm like, oh no.
Yes, yeah. Our publication came out before the budget, so we wouldn't anyway have majored much on national insurance contributions. Oops, did I mention that? Um, what we have covered are other aspects of the proposed legislation. Now, there's going to be a bill going through Parliament, and the devil's in the detail, obviously. But the government, well, first of all, through their manifesto, the Labour Party gave a clear signal that they want to sort out a number of issues within the employment regime that we have within this country, employment law regime. And I think one of the most interesting ones is flexible working. And they want to see employers give a lot of consideration to the fact that flexible working is pretty well here to stay. And we saw flexible working in a small way before the pandemic, where employers are openly now accepting that some people don't want to work 5 days a week. If it's typically a 5-day week job, they want to work less than that, and you could have job sharing. And that's actually been around for quite a long time when I think about it. Flexible working after the pandemic now is also about, do you really need to be in the office to do your job? And so there's going to be a legal right to flexible working. Quite what that will mean in practice, we'll have to wait and see from the legislation. But it might require the employer to think, right, this employee wants to work maybe even 5 days a week from home. And do I have any reason for that not happening? There could be a sort of burden of proof, if you like, on the employer to think through, am I being unreasonable in not allowing this? And so that's going to be something quite interesting. Specifically in education, I've come across one business that actually recognises school holidays. And so employees can have contracts of employment that allow them probably more leave than would normally be the case if you're employed by a business.
We used to have that actually in customer service, yeah.
Yeah. And so that could become it's dangerous to say it could become a legal entitlement, because that would be going too far. But it will be one of the flexibilities that people could ask for and that employers will have to consider. And is that reasonable? What else is there within the legislation that's planned? There's going to be an end to, I was going to say an end to probation periods, but that's not right. You will have a right to unfair dismissal from day one. And that's quite a radical change to the 2 years at the present time. But at the same time, the government is acknowledging that there has to be recognition of probation, that a worker coming in could be completely wrong for a particular role. In other words, that person was selected and the employer believed that person to be the right person for the job, but that doesn't work out. So there's going to be some consideration still of probation and quite how that will work.
It's definitely going to make, I think from our employment journey, I think there's a lot of money to be made probably from some kind of business coaches who can really help you get the right people, but also make sure that you're moving fast enough. Because I think that's the thing. Right now, it's easy to maybe not move as fast. And I just think people are going to have to be more laser focused, aren't they?
Yes, yeah. One interesting area that I think there's been a recent announcement that this won't happen was something that's happened in France and a number of other countries, where there's called the right to disconnect, and where you absolutely must not send emails expecting things back from employees during outside of working hours. This is called the right to switch off. That's a bit controversial. It would prove very difficult to work in practice. But having said that, other countries are doing this. But I don't think our plans for legislation are going to include that.
I also think it's difficult as well because, you know, when I think about the whole flexible working thing, before COVID, we already had a lot of the things that people now expect as normal.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
You know, most people worked from home quite a lot, and now it's a normal thing. So for us as a business, it doesn't really affect us. We're already, you know, hitting all of those things. But I think, particularly for schools, it'll be interesting to see if they'll also be expected to offer flexible working, and how is that actually possible, and what are the opportunities for education businesses to support with that, or there'll be opportunity somewhere.
Yes, yeah. It, it's very much a case of what fits into particular working practices, and above all else, what that role involves, and if that role involves engagement with pupils, or if it involves engagement with the staff within a school, then it's difficult to say that there can be absolute flexibility. And so, teachers, for example, yeah, in some cases, if you think about apprentice teachers, they have a day of off the job training, and that can be done at home rather than in the school. And that concept just could be developed further. And I think some schools are looking at this in terms of the time that is available to the teacher out of the classroom, that can be consolidated together and used by that teacher in a more flexible way, potentially working from home.
Yeah, I mean, in primary, you tend to find that it is grouped together. But I was a secondary teacher before I was a primary teacher, and it literally was like an hour here and an hour there, and it was very unusual to have more than an hour.
Yeah, yeah, that makes it more difficult, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah, and the time. Well, that's where the opportunities are. Then the timetabling software.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've obviously got a new government, and they're quite interested in education. So what? Obviously, they're doing a review at the moment, aren't they? What can you tell us about Labour's plan for UK education?
Yes, right. Well, they're going to find 6,500 new specialist teachers within the current Parliament.
Of course.
Look forward to that. I don't know what progress has been made in, gosh, it's the first 6 months now. That was one of the big commitments given in the manifesto, in which they have gone about with some determination to achieve. And the other significant one is free breakfast clubs. They want all primary schools to offer free breakfast clubs to improve attendance and learning outcomes. And what I've seen in the last few days is the first tranche of funding has been launched. You can find details of that on the DFE website. And that is to allow schools to bid for funding to support their development of free breakfast clubs. It's not clear from what I read whether this will be to support the development of new clubs. What if you already do this within your school, and many do? Can that funding come in to supplement what you're already doing? That is something you have to dive down into the detail of the funding rules, obviously, to understand. But the government has certainly moved ahead with that particular initiative. We know that private schools are now going to be more expensive to send your kids to. That is definitely implemented from January the 1st. And with retrospective effect, if you've paid your fees in advance, that's still causing a lot of rumbles of discontent. It is said that schools are in particular areas, and I can think of one primary school near where I am, where children generally come to the school for the first couple of years, then go off to private schools. And I'm told that there's an interest in a number of parents in placing their children back into the school. And that's going to be seen across the country, I would expect. In terms of curriculum, yes, we've got Professor Becky Francis leading a review group. And that, I think, if I'm correct in saying this, is now looking for evidence. There's been announcements in the last few days around that. A subject of enormous interest, of course, to education businesses, because it will mark a point in time when they're going to have to think, gosh, are the materials that I provide to schools still fit for purpose? What do I have to do to adapt them? When this last happened, and that was probably about 10 or 12 years ago, it did see some activity within the sector where some businesses that potentially didn't really have the working capital available to redevelop resources decided to throw in their lot with others. So there was a number of mergers and consolidations within the sector. And that may well happen again, because certainly if there are significant changes to content requirements, if you're a content provider, you've got to deliver that. You will have time to do it, obviously. There'll be a transition period. But it certainly is something that businesses in the sector will have a strong interest in at the present time and over the period of the review.
That's, I suppose, where it makes it harder sometimes for the smaller companies, because you got to be across everything.
Yes.
I remember we launched Classroom Secrets in 2013. The new curriculum obviously came in 2014. It's obviously not new anymore. And one thing that struck me was the messages that I would get asking me about the curriculum. And I was thinking, they didn't call me up, you know. They didn't call me up just because I'm an education company, and a really small one at that, and tell me the details. So there'll definitely be opportunities there, I think, where schools and teachers are wanting to know more information. And so anyone who can kind of package that up, it will be helpful.
Yeah, I think what you're saying is that training, a lot of education businesses do take seriously the fact that they can produce materials for use in the schools. Will they be used correctly? Well, that comes down often to training. And so, yes, there's a lot to look at in that area as well, if that's what you're referring to. A couple of other things that there's provisions likely to be in legislation to do with mental health support for schools. Now, this brings us into the tricky subject of the NHS, obviously, because mental health services would be sourced from the NHS. And schools are going to be entitled to enhanced mental health support. And there'll be various initiatives, including better data sharing, to identify and support children with special educational needs. And a lot's been said by ministers about this, but we're still waiting the detail of what that is in practice. And it would be an incredibly ambitious thing to do at the present time, I think, when there are so many competing priorities for the NHS.
And I think you can see more products on the market that are trying to help teachers with that. I also think in terms of the mental health crisis in schools, I think there's fear there from teachers, because you don't want to say the wrong thing. You're not necessarily trained in that area. You want to know that what you're doing, saying, providing is correct.
Yes.
And that definitely makes it more difficult, probably from a legal perspective more than anything else, even though you're not thinking about that when you're in the classroom. You're just thinking about the risks.
Yes, yeah.
Ofsted reforms. When we had a conversation before, you said to me that they were potentially considering Ofsteding the mat themselves. Is that still a thing, do you think?
I think it is. We have to wait for an education white paper to get confirmation of this. But certainly, Ofsted itself has felt that it's had one arm tied behind its back, if you like, by having this ability to inspect schools. But schools, of course, are now increasingly driven by the mat. You will have within the mat a number of specialists who in turn are providing training and support to the individual schools within the mat on curriculum subjects. And I think it's understandable that there is a bit of frustration on the part of Ofsted that it's inspecting the outcomes, if you like, of the work of the mat, but not the mat itself. And so this probably will happen, I would think, but we'll have to wait for a white paper to say something on that.
Yeah, it will be really, really interesting. I mean, we're definitely watching that as well. What are there any other updates on just Ofsted reforms in general?
I think they've now come out with a clearer picture on how inspection gradings, if they're still going to be called that, will be undertaken. I noticed an article in The Guardian, I think it was last week, about what they call a 5-step scale of colours or descriptions across 10 separate areas. And that would include inclusion and the people belonging within the school, feeling belonging within the school. And a lot more than that, obviously, if there's going to be 10 areas for inspection.
There are 10 areas, aren't they? And that's a conversation we had, actually. Obviously, a reform has been desired.
Yeah.
Yet now, instead of having 3 areas, now there's going to be 10 areas. So that's probably not going to go down very well.
No, we still have the dilemma of giving parents and prospective parents, people who want to put their children into particular schools, meaningful information. And it's been recognised that the one-word judgments were not doing really much good in that respect. And I think there may be a concern we're going to the other end of the scale now, making it overcomplicated.
I do think in some ways I'm not advocating for inspecting 10 areas, and I don't, pretend to be really up on it and really knowledgeable. No. But I think, so as a parent now, which I probably didn't realise before when I was looking, I think you get a better idea of exactly what you're looking for.
Yes.
And it might be that one particular school does really well at, for example, I see it a lot in the Facebook groups where a child might go to a school that I would deem a nice school, but they're not meeting the needs of maybe SEND, and maybe they want to go to a school that has some different facilities. Yes. And I suppose the 10 judgments will help you decide what's right for your child. The problem that I think there is that I think like that now my children are older, but I didn't know then, or actually I did choose a school based on what was needed then, but I would say maybe something different might be needed now. And so that is a tricky thing. And maybe if parents have more information about the 10 areas, yes, and they see needs developing, maybe they will be more likely to move the children. I'm not sure.
Yes. Yeah. Let's see what happens.
Yes, let's see what happens. Let's see if it makes things better or not. Yeah. I've just got one more thing on our list to talk about today, so I think we're doing well with time for a right. short episode. R&D grants.
Yes. This came to our attention about probably 6 months ago when a particular client said to us that they wondered if a process that HM Treasury has now embarked upon, has for some time embarked upon, of clawing back research and development credits, which can effectively be automatically claimed as part of your tax return. The concern was the clawing back of these benefits that you have within the taxation system was becoming a bit unfair. It's a difficult system to begin with. Let me explain what the system is. As I said, when you're preparing your tax return, you're entitled obviously to look at your costs to set against profit, because you don't want to pay too much tax on profit. So you look at the costs and you build up your costs to the extent it's practicable to do that. And you then have the right to take advantage of any government schemes that there are that can mitigate the tax liability that would arise on that profit. And one of the ways you can mitigate is research and development credits. So many companies across the country, not just in education but in other sectors as well, were taking advantage of this. And to be honest, the system was being abused. I don't think there's any doubt about that. When you have the owners of care homes arguing that they have research and development activity within their business that should be recognised. And of course, let me explain what I mean by that. A research and development activity is something that's going to benefit the business in the long term. So it's an investment, and it may be an investment that should be recognised now rather than the future when you see profits come in through that investment. So it's a way of accelerating innovation, if you like. And it's difficult to understand within the care home sector why so many companies were claiming R&D activities, describing things that they were doing in the care homes that were innovative. And so the government started to clamp down on this thing. Look, this is getting a bit ridiculous. And what has happened from that is a number of businesses have seen claims come in from the department for clawback of the research and development credits they've previously had. And so their profit figures for the years concerned are adjusted upwards, and therefore more tax is paid. And furthermore, they have to pay interest on the benefit they've had because they've retained more money than they should have done if they'd paid the correct level of tax earlier. And we're finding that there's a bit of inconsistency. There's obviously different people within HMRC that's handling this, and there's all sorts of reasons being given for the reclaim of the tax credit. One client that I've spoken to said, well, research and development is an education. Education is a social science rather than a pure science. And this person was taking a very rigid rule that if you're working on something that is an innovation that is scientific, you can claim the credit. If it's within the social science sector, maybe that person's feeling this is a bit softer in terms of what it is, and therefore you shouldn't have the benefit of the credit. Now, at a time when we're developing very clever ways of implementing AI, the problem that then exists is that companies that are doing this, they will have to ask themselves the question, do we want to make a claim for a research and development credit, not being sure that it will be accepted because it's a system that's retrospective. You can make the claim and then thereafter forget you've done it, you've got the benefit of it, but suddenly 2 or 3 years later, you have HMRC requesting money back because they feel that the R&D credit claim was wrong. And it's actually disincentivizing people. I do know that there are companies that are not attempting to claim R&D credits when perhaps they had a legitimate reasons for claiming.
And I suppose that's probably what they want to happen as well, because you basically need to invest in R&D and you might get the money back, but you have to be able to invest in it yourself and want to, and it'd be a nice surprise if you if you get the money back, rather than, or I will invest in this because it will be funded.
I think what businesses would really prefer is a system where there is a green light given by HMRC in advance of the investment being made. This idea that you make your investment, it's then the subject of the R&D credit claim, and therefore you pay less profit in that year, but hanging over you for the next several years until HMRC get round to looking at it, and they will do random inspections, so it might not be looked at by HMRC, but if it's randomly selected, then there could be a clawback of that funding. And for smaller businesses, that's obviously a big issue. We're talking sometimes significant money being reclaimed.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be clearer around what is R&D, I mean, it's definitely something we've looked at before, and it's very hard to understand and very grey.
If this is something where you are interested, you have the time to spend on it, to go onto the HMRC website, and there's guidance on how the system works and what constitutes an innovation that could benefit from the R&D credit. That's the best advice, is to look at what is on the government website and speak to your accountants, making sure you've got sensible accountants, I should say. Those from the care homes maybe didn't have sensible accountants. They obviously had accountants trying to impress the customer, but not really understanding the rules. So
I would recommend making sure that you've got somebody who is experienced, actually.
Yes.
When we've claimed R&D before, rather than just do it through our standard accountant, it was like, yay, everything should be R&D.
Yeah.
We actually used an accountant who had a specialist R&D tax accountant who had worked at HMRC.
Yes.
So it's like, right, well, you definitely know then, so we're safe.
Yeah.
So I'd recommend that if you're going to do it. What's coming up in the next issue?
Yeah, let's give listeners a preview. We've got BET 2025 coming up, obviously, and our next edition of Commercial Education Brief will be out a couple of weeks before that. And within that edition, with BET in mind, we tend to focus quite a bit on education technology. And one area that is going to be of considerable interest, and I spoke to a particular business last week about this, and they were very excited by what I could tell them, is something that's been a bit under the radar screen to date. Since we came out of Europe, to mention that dreadful word Brexit again, we've not been party to legislation that has been passed in Europe. Europe has passed what's called the Digital Markets Act, and that act has the aim of managing the big, heavy-duty technology companies that can so dominate the market. So we're thinking of Microsoft, Apple, Google, and they now have the ability within Europe to lay down rules that these big providers have to work to if they feel that they could be or are acting in what's called an anti-competitive way. It's called pro-competition legislation. What has happened in Europe is that Apple has been subject to a series of undertakings that they're now complying with. There's one area that I think we all just live with this, we don't think twice about it, But let's say you want to find a new app to go on your smartphone. Well, where do you go? You go to the Google Store or you go to the Apple Store, and you will find the app. You might have to do some searching, quite a lot of searching to get to it. And we're all living under the assumption that that's the way you have to do it. You have to use Apple, and it's Apple's decision where on the App Store that app is. Let's say that you wanted to provide the market, so this is the education market we're talking about, with a dedicated store that only had education apps within it. Well, that doesn't seem to work at the moment because you have to go through the App Store. What the European institutions have succeeded in doing through the undertakings they've been able to get from Apple under the Digital Markets Act is an acceptance by Apple that they have to make available the technology, their iOS system, to allow others to put a sales platform on the Apple smartphone. And so now any significant provider of apps can now have a dedicated store on the smartphone. That's the position in Europe, and Apple is now, I think they've pretty well accepted that this is the way the world's going to be, so they're taking steps to deal with that at the moment. There was an update from the European Commission recently that suggested Apple is being compliant in this. But let's go back to where we are in the UK. We don't have the Digital Markets Act, but we do have something which I mentioned on the last discussion we had, Claire, and that is the Digital Markets Competition and Consumers Act. And this is not quite a mirror image of the Digital Markets Act, but it's tackling the same subjects. It's identifying businesses that have what are called strategic status, and included within that are bound to be the likes of Apple, Google, Microsoft. And it's very likely we will follow the same approach as within Europe, because when parts of a large provider such as Apple are designated as having strategic status, then the powers that are going to be available to the Competition and Markets Authority will include pro-competition powers. And they'll be able to say to Apple, you have to actually provide a basis on which people can market their apps, not quite independently of you, because they will rely on your phone, but your phone is just one part of this. And whilst they can market through your phone at the moment, they can't market on a more dedicated way, offering choice to the consumer. And so we're going to be writing an article explaining that and explaining the potential of that, which I think is very significant because, as I say, it will start to make businesses in the education sector think about dedicated platforms. There's also going to be an article on copyright and how it works in the education sector. And, well, it's the beginning of 2025, so we might as well do some horizon scanning. We're finding ourselves still in the early stages of a new government. There's going to be lots of legislation coming through in 2025, including data protection, and also in the area of, we know that the area of how children interact with the web is the subject of online safety legislation. We're going to see that implemented. It's taken quite a while, but Ofcom has been consulting on their rules of engagement, if you like, with the sector. It's going to get really interesting in 2025 because that will start to be implemented, and we'll be covering that as well.
Super. Wow. Well, there's lots to look forward to, lots of information to find out in the new year then.
Yes. Yeah. That issue will be out in the second week of January.
Super. So you'll be working hard over Christmas getting it all finished?
It's just about there, actually. From .gov, we always have .gov where we cover the latest policy statements coming out of government that are of interest to the sector. That's always the last minute bit of it.
Yeah. What, are you going to bet?
I should be at bet, yes. Yeah.
I might see you there.
I always have to buy myself new shoes after I've been to bet.
Because of all the walking around you've done?
Yeah.
I haven't been for a number of years, but this year we're actually up for an award.
Very good.
So who knows? I have to record the video for it later. So
right. Yes.
Wish me luck.
Yes.
Wish me luck.
Yeah.
So, right. Well, thank you so much, Frank, and hopefully you have found this really useful, if you're listening, and we'll be together again in about 3 months' time.
Yes. Thanks very much, Claire.
Thank you for listening to the Education Business Podcast. To get more information to grow your business, sign up at educationbusinessclub.co.uk.